Good afternoon. My name is Sophia Kolak. I'm an undergraduate student at Columbia University, and today I'll be talking about our empirical study of the ROS ecosystem. This research was conducted at Carnegie Mellon University in collaboration with Austin Afzal, Claire Leguest, Michael Hilton, and Chris Timperley. So every year, robots become more and more important part of industry, manufacturing, and even, as this lovely gift shows, our very own homes. But just because robots are becoming more commonplace doesn't mean that the difficulties of constructing a robot are in the past. In fact, even just a simple Roomba combines advanced knowledge from a variety of different disciplines. If we take a closer look at the pieces of a Roomba, we see sensors, motors, batteries, all of the parts of the vacuum, and that's just the hardware. There's also a software stack that integrates all of these components and makes high-level decisions about behavior. And for a long time, the sheer complexity of dealing with all of these literal moving parts really hindered robotics because there was no standardized way of doing all of these things. People felt they were constantly reinventing the wheel. But luckily, in about 2009, the robot operating system was designed. And this framework was designed to solve these low-level implementation problems by providing a middleware in which people could exchange code. So, for instance, experts in motor control could share their code with experts in sensor design. And this modularity and ability to reuse code was really powerful. And as a result, ROS became the most popular robotics framework. But even so, ROS is no conventional software ecosystem. It needs to combine information from electrical, software, and mechanical engineering, as well as fields like artificial intelligence, math, and physics. And no one's ever really understood how all of these things come together in one ecosystem. And so we set out to do this study, specifically focusing on how collaboration really works within ROS. We created two related data sets. The first is the ROS distro. This is about 3,000 packages that are released on ROS's official GitHub. So this is really the framework itself. And the second data set is the ROS client data. This is about 200,000 projects. And these are actual robotics projects that are built against the ROS framework. So the first thing we did was take a really close look at the ROS distro. We found these 6 distinct entities that contribute code to ROS. The bottom 4 are pretty self-explanatory. The top 2 are a bit more nuanced. Interest groups are sort of more loose and are not officially associated with open robotics or the maintainers of ROS, whereas foundational working groups are really formally associated with open robotics, and these are the fundamental building blocks that are required to construct a robot. And once we figured out that these groups existed, we wanted to study their influence within the ecosystem. And so we studied influence in 2 ways. First, in terms of the number of packages that each entity was contributing, and second, in terms of the amount of packages depending on them. So how many reverse dependencies they've accrued. And so the first graph on the left, right, has time as its x-axis, and on the y is just the number of packages. And you can clearly see here in yellow that companies are by far the fastest growing group in terms of the amount of code or the number of packages that they're contributing to the ecosystem. But conversely, on the right, again, we have time on the x-axis, but on the y, we have reverse dependencies or the number of dependencies on a package created by that group. And you can see here in blue that working groups are by far the fastest growing in terms of their use within the ecosystem. And so this really establishes that even though working groups are not the biggest in terms of the number of packages, they are really the most important in terms of dependencies. And so once that importance had been established, we wanted to see if it held up when we looked at the actual client projects. And in fact, we found that this trend was actually more extreme when we looked at this data set. 82% of the clients are exclusively relying on the working groups. And this is a bit surprising considering that the working groups are focused on providing the basic functionality. And so we would expect, even though many packages might need to implement these things, we would also expect them to have additional dependencies. So it was a bit surprising that so many packages didn't do that. And this really suggests that there is a significant portion of the ecosystem that is being ignored. Disregarding those implementations for sort of newer, less developed parts of ROS, we did see the working groups as a really successful example of how collaboration could sort of get off the ground and make really useful code. And so our next question or our next task was really to take a a closer look at how collaboration was structured within these working groups. And you can see here this really, really interesting trend that each one of the working groups is focused on a different specialty within robotics. So you have one group working on perception, another working on controls, another working on planning. And you know, these are areas in robotics that maybe a group of PhDs or a lab might focus on. And so this really answers our initial question about how ROS manages the necessity of domain-specific knowledge within its ecosystem. It's divided along these specialties and allowed spaces for people who are experts in all of these areas to sort of, come together and work on their tasks. And the other really interesting thing about these working groups is that they are unique within ROS. So based on what we know about other software ecosystems, we might expect that there'd be 6 different perception stacks in ROS, and one of them would just have the most dependencies and be the most used. But in fact, we don't find that at all. We find there is really just one perception stack that everyone implements. So there aren't competing implementations. And this is really interesting in that it suggests that ROS developers are actually really working together to create one really robust project as opposed to competing. And this may just be due to the sheer difficulty of putting together a working planning stack or a working set of drivers. But the downside of the foundational working groups is that the contribution to them, or the number of official members in these organizations, has really slowed over the past few years. So this graph on the x-axis just shows time again, and on the y, the number of developers. And you can see that these lines are pretty much all logarithmic, showing that there's been slowed interest in these groups. And actually only one new developer has been added to any of the groups in the year 2020. Other groups like ROS Simulation and Purple have not gotten any new members since 2013. And additionally, the largest of these groups has only 25 members. And so this, of course, means that there's a relatively small number of people responsible for maintaining the most dependent on and important code in ROS. And this has implications for the ecosystem as a whole. As it grows and expands, gets new developers, these working groups could really become a bottleneck to the ecosystem's success and growth. And so, ROS right now is transitioning from its first major version to its second, ROS 2. So hopefully the people at Open Robotics will take this into consideration as they design their new ecosystem. And that's all for me. Thank you guys so much for listening. A bit of shameless self-promotion. I'm currently applying to graduate school, so feel free to tweet at me or email me or talk to me after this. And thank you guys so much.